Hello everybody, welcome. I'm walking in the garden, as I often am. One of my favorite places to be. Was thinking a bit about lucid waking, and sometimes when I think, it's very profound to be able to think as a writer. Right, because now, as a writer, us adults, we can have some difficulty finding a venue where our imagination can play and flow and become florid, flower. And since I haven't been writing a whole bunch for a while, I kind of stopped thinking as a writer. Now, of course, you don't have to be a writer to think like a writer might. In fact, you don't have to write at all. But you can imagine stories, adventures, situations while you're awake that are a little bit like dreaming. Or rather, this form of imagining, it creates a venue. And one of the things that can destroy a venue for imagination is too strong a presence of critical thought. In fact, one of the primary transformations of awareness that happens between dreaming and waking mind is the introduction of critical thought, right? And critical thought isn't merely critical, it's declarative about identity. That is a piece of wood. This is a garden. This is my voice. This is the path. That is the sky. There is the sun. That is the tree. There is the bird. This room I'm awakening in is the same room I went to sleep in, and is continuous in time and is familiar, has memories associated with it as a place in our life, all these things, right? And many other things, comparisons, qualitative evaluations, quantitative evaluations. And all of this activity is fairly formal, right? It's fairly explicit. And what that does when our awareness is doing that is it essentially evicts imagination, right? It sort of says to, well, it doesn't say anything, but it implies to imagination, first of all, you're unnecessary. Secondly, you're superfluous, right? You have nothing to add, because that's either a brick or it's not a brick, right? There's this weird sort of facticity about waking consciousness. And as we grow older, first, slowly, and then very rapidly, and then deeper and deeper, our imagination is evicted from our common waking experience, unless, of course, we find ways to introduce it. But even when we introduce it, we're introducing it in the kingdom of the critical voice, the waking mind. So it can be difficult for our imagination to flourish and find freedom to be expressed in our waking life. And many people are fascinated, perhaps rightly so, with the experiences, the incredible array of experiences that are available to us when we're in a state that we might call lucid dreaming. And essentially what's meant by this is just that we are in the dreaming mind, and in the dreaming mind we either become aware that we're dreaming, or the dream transforms in the same way that it would if we were aware that we are dreaming, without us being formally aware that we are dreaming, right? So these are two aspects of the lucid dreaming experiences, or these are ways of thinking about these experiences anyway. And so lucid dreaming is a wonderful and amazing thing to practice. Surely there are some people who have troubling experiences in lucid dreaming too. But many people report ecstatic, blissful, astonishing experiences of incredible vitality and vividness, as if the colors themselves are alive and are beings and are something we don't even have a word for in English, which is a living source of stimuli that transforms you, right, like sunlight does, except it's a kind of intelligence and it's a kind of emotionality. And so in dreaming, our experience can have all these astonishing qualities that we ordinarily don't experience while awake, with some exceptions. And it's interesting to me that there's the two, in my somewhat limited but nonetheless remembered experiences of lucid dreaming. It's very common, of course, So there's a thing that I call a Gronch in dreaming. It's a neologism, a word I made up. And a Gronch is a situation in dreaming where the faculties of our waking mind begin to very gently at first intrude on the dreaming experience. Right? I don't know why I have this example that I always use. Perhaps I should create a new one. So here's the Gronch. The Gronch is a sort of branching, and it has three common paths that it develops into. And the first path is, well, first of all, let me explain that generally speaking, and there are exceptions, you don't have to have an actual question for there to be a Gronch, but the dreaming mind, into the dreaming context, there's another layer of awareness intrudes for a moment, and there may be a question. For example, let's say I'm dreaming that I see a bird and it's flying upside down. The Gronch, that could be a Gronch if an aspect of critical awareness becomes involved and says something like, why is the bird flying upside down? Or that I just feel the question. Something's not quite right about that bird. Usually, see, in dreaming it can be very gentle. It isn't always, hey, that's not supposed to happen. It's more like, there's something unusual about that thing I'm seeing or wondering. And then that slowly transforms into a more focused concern. And by the way, this process illustrates what we can think of as the collapsing the beginning of the collapse of the dream universe into the thinking, identifying, waking mind. Right? So we may start out just with curiosity. That bird's very unusual, right? It's not yet clear that birds don't fly upside down because we're still dreaming, right? So we might just first notice, that's unusual. And then we might feel some kind of an interest in the unusualness for a moment. And this is, again, the process of, it's as if an aspect of the dream, within the manifold of the dream, an aspect is collapsing, slowly flowing into and toward concrete identity and polarities and accounting and things much more common in our waking experience. So we may encounter some anomaly in a dream, although it's not necessary to encounter one to have this concern. Sometimes the awareness that one is dreaming just spontaneously arises. Poop, I'm dreaming. So a Gronch begins with either the possibility of the transformation of awareness in the dream to include either the formal awareness, right? In one's dream, one thinks, I am dreaming. Yeah. Or something like this. One becomes aware that one is dreaming. Whether or not there's language associated with it is an entirely different question. And it begins with a feeling, right? It begins with a feeling. So the Gronch has 3 outcomes, and one of them, let's say I saw something anomalous. I remember once in a dream, on a bush outside a house, there were people in I wanted to visit. I saw a yellow jacket, right, the wasp, and it was like the size of a golden retriever, and it was sitting on top of this bush. And that was a Gronch. In that case, the yellow jacket just seemed to be much more fascinating than useful. Its size expressed how interesting it was, right? So instead of me thinking something like, or thinking something like, that's not supposed to be big, that's too big, what is that? Why is that so big? I just felt and thought, that's really interesting, right? It's just, you see how the dream maintains the generality? It doesn't decide what's going on or what should be or what shouldn't be. In this case, it just notices, that's fascinating. What an astonishing phenomenon, without thinking about naming it or anything. And this is really profound and beautiful, because we always have this capacity of consciousness. It's just that most of the time it's shut down. The classic example that I use for a Gronch explanation is, suppose I find myself running through a castle. I know that a monster is chasing me, and I turn around and I can see there's like a little 6-inch tall pink Tyrannosaurus that looks really furious, and it's chasing me. And then for a moment I wonder, wait a minute, why am I in a castle? Or how could it be that a small pink Tyrannosaurus Rex is chasing me in a castle, right? Or something of this nature. Now, this is a moment where a Gronch happens, and the 3 outcomes are 1, essentially the dream calms you down or transforms in such a way that you are your attention is redirected away from that concern, right? And then you keep dreaming. And one of the ways it can do this is it will quickly improvise a historical scenario that resulted in this, And once you see that there is a scenario that resulted in this, you just go on dreaming, right? The concern and the sort of conflict dissolves back into the flow of the dreaming. And so you go on with whatever you may have been up to. So that's one path. And I find it really interesting that the dream can backfill histories. Now, of course, it's not clear that time is linear in dreaming. In fact, I suggest time has all kinds of dimensions in dreaming that are missing from our common awareness of linear time, or our experience in what we imagine to be linear time. It's just really interesting that the dreaming mind or dreaming awareness can instantly improvise a scenario that satisfies the concern. It's like a key fitting into a lock, almost, right? Oh, you're here because this happened, and before that happened there was this, and you were going here, and then these two things occurred, and that led to blah, blah, blah. Now, it doesn't do that in language. It just does it by manipulating memory in such a way that it's as if you have a memory of the sequence that led up to the strange situation in which you had the question that led to the Gronch, right? So it can directly manipulate memory. This is really important, right? It can produce in memory histories and other things, schemas that, how shall I put this? It can produce schemas of meaning, identity, relation, situation that are ordinarily very uncommon in our waking world experience, or they're turned down so low, right? Like the volume knob is turned down to just barely present. And so we don't have, these experiences and abilities and understandings of the dimensionality of identity and time and existence and being and awareness and all of this while we're awake. And we may not have conscious experience of them while we're dreaming, in that we can tell we're having the experience, and of course this is part of what lucid dreaming is about. But they're present, right? So new forms of dimensionality naturally emerge from our dreaming experience, so that we feel the spirit or character or essences of things in precedence to knowing what they are or what they're supposed to be or any of that kind of stuff. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that important? Isn't that amazing? Think of the implications of this, right? That while we're awake, 80% of the faculties of our minds are shut down and compressed into very utilitarian modes. And it can be extremely difficult to reintroduce what I think of as their natural dimensionality and flexibility and potential, because the iron grip of waking consciousness can be either really severe, or if there's a lot of conflict, and like rationally, or if there's a lot of conflict, it can be insane, right? It just does sort of loopy, incoherent things very forcefully all the time, right? And all kinds of different. It can collapse into different forms, but it tends to stay collapsed. This waking consciousness of identity, relation, meaning, felt sense of the spirit or character of beings and moments and places. The flavor of existence can get lost in the strange courtroom-like structured narrative of waking consciousness. And so our imagination is trapped outside of it mostly. There are exceptions. So back to the Gronch, just to finish this up. One branch is the dream resolves the imposition of the possibility of collapse toward waking, sometimes by transforming memory to produce figures that have the shape quality sufficient to neutralize the aspect of awareness that was beginning to become critical. That's not exactly the right word. Denotative, right? The denotative aspect of consciousness. The one that, like a god, actually, like as if we have a little god inside us, tells us what things are, what they're for, what's supposed to be and not supposed to be, what the numbers are, this kind of stuff. And you see how this is very formally, representationally structured, whereas what's going on in the dream is a very different kind of thing. But let's finish the Gronch branch situation. So branch one is you keep dreaming. It resolves the sort of mini crisis is neutralized. Branch two is the beginning of the formation of structure and what we might refer to as the dreaming manifold, right? Starts to form up this structure. Hey, that's not supposed to be, or wait, that doesn't make sense, or why is it that one of my shoes is green and the other one is red? Like it may start with a question, but it can also start with a feeling. In the second branch, this collapse towards structure proceeds and it becomes kind of pointy, right? It builds a point. And it's a point in thought. It's a point in awareness. It's a pointy aspect of awareness. And that pointy aspect begins to penetrate the manifold that it is itself emerging from, right? As if the dream were like a strange multi-soap bubble with little kinds of bubbles inside and so on and so forth. And it's floating, and occasionally one bubble pops and three more emerge, and we are this bubble in dreaming. And then one aspect inside the multi-bubble starts to acquire static structure. And you can see how if a part of a bubble begins to become a static structure, the bubble can't continue to bubble. So the dream produces an element, or actually one could think of it different ways, and should think of it in different ways. It's like the intrusion of the waking mind. The waking mind is sort of poking a finger into the dreaming universe, just often very gently at first, though not always. And the dreaming flow substance begins to form into a structured element within the manifold. And in case two, that element continues to acquire structure and sort of different kinds of pointiness, and that eventually results in it piercing the manifold in such a way that the whole thing collapses and we wake up. And we wake up usually with if we remember, and ordinarily we may, depending on how our memory is working, we may only remember the last few dreams or the last dream before we awoke, or maybe even just scenes from that dream. And sometimes we can awaken and be in a sort of twilight state where we're mostly awake, but there are still pulses and flows of dreaming surfacing in consciousness. And this is a very interesting thing here. It's actually part of what I hope to speak about. So branch two is the introduction of waking mind-like awareness collapses the dreaming manifold. And these are just toys. I'm not saying this is how it is. These are perspectives that I've come to entertain over my own explorations of dreaming and waking and what the relationship is there. What's all this about? Is really my question. And that's a much weirder thing to try to answer. So we'll stay on the Gronch. The third branch is that the partial intrusion of structure. And the structure can come in different ways, right? It can be a question, but it could also be, for example, that we're dreaming in the room in which we are dreaming. So what I mean is, in the dream, we are in the same place that our body actually is. And this can cause the transformation and a variety of other astonishing transformations. In my experience anyway, when I have a dream that's in the room, that's taking place in a dream version of the room I'm in, there's something unusual going on, and very important to distinguish from other kinds of dreaming scenarios and ask questions about. So it's not always a question. It's a feeling in the dreaming environment, and a transformation of awareness from something like pure participation to, what should we call it, determinative activity. So in the third branch, what happens essentially is somehow the waking mind and the dreaming mind, they get kind of spirally mixed together in the flow of dreaming. As if the dreaming mind puts a spin on the pointy thing, and now that it's spinning in this toy idea, it doesn't collapse the bubble and we become aware that we're dreaming. And that awareness can either be formal, in the sense that we essentially have something like a thought, again, probably not in language, I'm dreaming. Now sometimes right after noticing that just collapses the bubble and people wake up. But other times it doesn't. And then astonishing phenomena take place. Now the dream gets like super dimensionality. Right? It had extra dimensionality as a regular dream, but once we become lucid, it has new degrees of liberty that we can explore and embody, because actually we're exploring being a dream, right? Becoming a dream. Yes, our body is still on the bed or the couch or whatever, of course, but we are being a dream. And so we fall asleep, and when we don't have to support the incredible energetic needs of the waking, moving body, right, we can reduce the funding, so to speak, to all of that. And that actually helps the body, right, because the pace of everything slows down, and the effort slows down. Our organs can rest and regenerate, and our muscles and bones and fascia and mitochondria can all do astonishing things, including making poops, which is definitely something that's happening while we're, asleep, and probably has some impact on our dreaming. Different topic, though, so I'll stay with the Gronch. There's kind of classic things that happen when people are lucid dreaming. And one of them is flight, and sometimes it's spontaneous, right? And again, these processes, they can be more or less in a kind of layer of consciousness that's engaged in the experience. The waking layer that can know things and think things and have a plan and try things, right? The subjective perceiver, in a way, who is both in an experience but coming at the experience from outside it. right? And so sometimes we might just begin flying. Other times I've heard people say they tried to convince other people in the dream that this was a dream and they can do amazing things. Usually that project tends to fail. I haven't heard of it succeeding. But all kinds of amazing adventures can happen when waking consciousness is mixed with dreaming consciousness in such a way that it doesn't dominate it, they enhance each other. That's an incredibly important thing right there. That's what we actually need to be experiencing while we are awake. But it's as if there was an accident a long time ago, kingdoms clashed, one fell into the underworld, the other dominated the waking world in a very confused way, thinking that its twin was its enemy, even though its twin is really its origin. And what I mean by that is that the capacity for us to have waking minds and critical awareness and denotative thought and to evict imagination from our waking experience is actually, dun dun dun, big reveal here, those are over-structured functions of imagination. Without imagination, you can't do any of those things. And by the way, machines don't have imagination. They can't participate in information the way that we must. We don't have there's no other way of being. We participate in denotative consciousness. And waking consciousness, waking awareness and thought and language and so on, representational consciousness, these are all over-structured figments of years of dreaming. And without our imagination, they don't work, they do nothing. They don't work at all, they don't do anything. Without imagining something, the idea that this is a bird or that is a tree or I am a hero or I am a fool or I am a man or anything, right? These, one moment. One moment. These tokens are meaningless unless they are imbued with the living, flowing awareness that they originate from, which is imagination. Now, it's weird that we could form a tool with imagination that locks most of imagination out. But that's what rationality does. That's what mathematics is, in a way. Now, weirdly, you have to be really imaginative to produce tools like these, or to even to use them. Right? They require imagination to be meaningful. No imagination, those symbols on the page, meaningless. Right? So, in our waking experience, faculties and assets of the imaginal mind and the dreaming mind become standing structures in the same way that, and dominate the space in the same way that if I go to downtown, right, there are huge skyscrapers, there are buildings everywhere, there's no living space. It's all paved. It's all like hard, permanent, continuous structure. So our waking mind is the product, of the history of the production in memory of something like tokens. Structured schemas of identity, meaning, value, number, quality. They're like little containers, right? That can preserve things over time. And the containers have astonishing properties, most of which we're unaware of because we don't examine them this way usually. We're never trained to, and unless we're very imaginative and curious, there's no way we'll stumble across this. These containers sacrifice dimensionality for reliability, right? And they are part of the stock in trade of the representational overcultures that our human beingness is subject to, right, and has to interact with, usually. Or, I mean, even if we run away, we're still interacting with it, right? It's still there, it's still around us, still affecting the other people and the animals and the world and the plants and all of this. So over time, layers and layers of structure were set down, and we inherit this weird sort of mishmash of often conflicting structures and thinking as we grow up in the cultures and with the languages we're imprinted with. So the Gronch either continues the dream, collapses into waking, or becomes lucid. And the reason that I'm introducing this topic, and thank you for bearing with my very long introduction, is that awareness is fundamentally Gronchy. Right? It's like, yes, most of us always take branch 2 before things get even slightly, how to put it, more flexible, right? Before things start to get extra dimensionality in our experience. Imagine, for example, that I hear each of my footfalls as a musical note. Right? In a dream, no problem. Now, my dreaming mind, I think, was involved in producing that example, by the way. So what I just did there was a little bit Gronchy, right? But instead of introducing the waking mind's modes into the dreaming context, I'm introducing the dreaming mind's modes into the waking context. And this can become really fascinating and adventurous and wonderful and entertaining, ecstatic, educational. It can generate insights that are otherwise impossible to achieve. Like most of the time with our waking minds, many of us, not all of us, some of us are wildly creative or imaginative. But most of the times with our waking minds, we're just kind of plodding through the structured terrain. The same way we might if we were on some kind of chore in a city, drive to this spot, pick this up, bring it here, pick that up here, take it there. This is sort of how a lot of waking consciousness proceeds. And it's dead inside, right? And this is why people are suffocating, even though they may have the necessities of life. They're starving, moment to moment, for imaginal nourishment, for a venue where the imagination can play all of the astonishing roles, including the actual creation of experiential universes out of thin air, while we're awake. Right? And people may have non-ordinary experiences. Now again, some people are sort of half dreaming all the time, I'm sure, right? But we don't tend to give them a lot of authorization. We don't give them a lot of airplay most of the time. And there are a few venues in which that would seem appropriate. But one of them is writing, right? If people can dream up something really amazing and write it, or make a film out of it, and you can see that both of those things resemble dreams, right? I mean, what are we watching on TV? Well, we're not watching what we're actually watching, because what we're actually watching is being produced on purpose, and there's cameras in the room that we can't see, and lighting equipment, and the sets are only half built, and there's lots of interesting things to notice here, because in dreaming the sets aren't complete. They don't have to be complete. They only have to be relatively complete in the place of presence of our awareness in the dream, right? Now, I'm not saying they're like TV sets or movie sets. But they do have this quality of being surrounded by incompleteness. And that's also really interesting. Because denotative awareness pretends to completeness. Once I know that's a tree, I know what that is. Right? Well, hopefully you can see that not only is that not true, so it's actually a lie. The only whatness that knowing that that's a tree really does on its own is it tells us something about what category the phenomenon belongs to. But the urge to determine the category tends to inhibit both imagination and relation. Now, we may have discovered what we think trees are and do, and what we think we can do and not do with them. We may think we know what that is, right? And the most common thing for waking consciousness to do is turn things and beings into either they're a commodity, or they're a threat, or they're an opportunity, or you can ignore them and go on with whatever kind of distracted nonsense that we were distracting ourselves with. Right? This is a lot of waking consciousness. Now, of course, it can do other cool things like engineering and planning things and mapping them and analyzing them. Yes, the waking, this layer has useful features unless they dominate everything else and mostly exclude it, in which case we have a standing crisis and our life becomes miserable inside. So, our waking experience is Gronchy in the sense that we don't have to pick branch 2, right? Now, branch 1 is a little weird because, now I see, yeah. So first of all, I'm improvising here, and I've never spoken of waking world Gronchiness before, or even thought about it. So I think that there's a waking world analog that's sort of the polar opposite of the concern in the dream about why something's weird, right? The bird is flying backwards. Ordinarily fine. Introduce a little bit of waking world critical thought. Suddenly we have a problem. So I think there's not just a waking world polarity of that, but a number of different ones. The same way there are a number of different kinds of concerns that can lead to a Gronch in a dream. And there's all kinds of different ways that a feeling can form that accomplishes the sort of opposite of lucid dreaming, which is the intrusion of dreaming consciousness and awareness and forms and participation into waking consciousness. And what I mean by participation is the incredible intimacy that is felt when one is the world. The world is me, right? And the idea that I had was, that sparked all this, was just a writerly thought that someone asks me, where are you going? And I say, I'm going to the place where places are beings. This was my writerly thought that launched this whole discussion. For most of us, places aren't beings. And we may feel some of the beingness and participation of place. But if the dreaming mind could intrude in the right kind of way to our waking consciousness, we would have the feeling that's often very subtle in the dream that, oh, all of this is me. All of this is me. This is inside me. And I am inside all of this right now. The felt sense of that, not the thought, right? And, there are many paths there are many ways we can recover this capacity, which we all had as children, right? We started out with this, right? Something happened to it. There are many ways we can recover this. And one of the senses is fascination. If I suddenly become really fascinated with a flower, the shape and nature of my awareness, it transforms. Or a bird, or this place, or this moment of the day, right? Or the strange. What if I suddenly became aware that when I'm dreaming, I don't feel gravity? Right? This is Gronchy, right? When I'm dreaming, I don't feel gravity. I don't feel the weight of my body on my footsteps. In fact, I don't recall feeling my footsteps. Though there have been strange ways of moving in dreams that are very interesting to me, and I think probably very old in Earth's, life lineages. So there's different ways to introduce concern. And one of the promises of romantic love is the constant reintroduction of something deeply resembling the intimate felt sense of I am more than me, right? And we are one. So I am in you and you are in me. And we go together, and that transforms everything because we are together, right? The meaning of the tree is much less declarative when me and my beloved adore it together and wonder and ask questions and play, right? So there's all kinds of ways to become, to sort of, how shall we put it, evoke or invoke the door through which aspects of our dreaming intelligences can emerge meaningfully into consciousness. And it won't mean we won't be able to do ordinary things or negotiate physical reality. It will mean that our felt sense of being in physical reality will be vastly richer in ways that are actually really hard to imagine if you've not directly experienced them, and extremely difficult to fit into any kind of ordinary language, though some forms of poetry or music evoke these senses that, again, while we're awake, are mostly inhibited. So I'm very interested in the idea of lucid waking and the capacity to have writerly ideas. I have many little sort of dreamlike visions of the beginnings of a story in my mind. But today, when I just imagined, I am going to the place where the places are beings, as my answer to where are you going, I immediately was aware that that answer comes from something deep inside me that's more true than rational thought. It's fundamental to the essence of my being, and without it, rational thought is meaningless. Now I'll mention briefly, and I want to say a few preparatory words about this. In our situation, we have available to us constantly many kinds of intoxicants. And some of them are behavioral intoxicants, right? They're just things we do. And some of them are technological intoxicants, like our smartphones and TVs and computers and smartwatches and pads and cars and all kinds of, endless forms of watches. I mean, it just goes on forever. It's an infinite morass of objects we can invest in somehow or become lost through, in a way. So intoxicants often are presented in lieu of the invocation of our actual dreaming mind. Now, of course, if we're watching a really good film, part of our dreaming mind and imagination becomes involved, right? And we bond with certain characters in a manner of speaking. And we, have ideas about how it could be different or what so-and-so should have done, so forth. We become sort of consciously involved, but also imaginally involved, if it's really good. Now, a book is a weirder thing, because a book is almost like a dreaming catalyst, right? If you're imaginative and you read, and you're deeply engaged with what you're reading, with your imagination and your intelligence and your curiosity, then the book sort of makes you dream. Or rather, it's an experience of lucid waking, right? You're having an experience of imagining beings and events, and also your relation with them, and feeling your relation with them, while you're sitting in a chair in a library, or in a cafe, or in your house, or in the field. So a book can introduce a kind of limited lucid waking. Curiosity about deep questions and the world, and how those two things, like there's nothing missing from anything around me. Every question of physics is probably answered in any leaf, right? Though there are perhaps layers of abstraction that are proper primarily to structured human thought in mathematics and other disciplines. So we have intoxicants, and some of these intoxicants are either counterfeiting our dreaming faculties, or they've captured them and we're being sold back a kind of broken version that doesn't really have a lot of room for our participation, but we're so hungry, in a sense, that we'll consume it because something in us remembers that we can dream our lives and be dreaming while we're awake, be lucidly waking. And unfortunately, many of these intoxicants have the property that, in a way, the more we consume them, the hungrier we get, right? Just like any intoxicant. Right? Where's the limit? Where's the limit? And many of them are toxic. That's why we call them intoxicants. So they're poisonous. They're not nourishing. They're not healthy. We do them instead of something much better we could be doing and being and feeling and growing into together, and even on our own. But the particular class of intoxicants that we refer to as hallucinogens, this class, which I think of as quite dangerous and worthy of profound respect, in a way not dissimilar to how a firearm is worthy of profound respect. Respect for their danger, right? And it's not easy to see their danger until you've had a view of awareness that's very broad. So I want to be very clear that I'm not making a recommendation for the use of hallucinogens here. My position on the use of hallucinogens is complex, or my positions, and they vary depending on what the question is. It's not just one idea, but they're dangerous. But one of the qualities they have is that they can, under the influence of hallucinogens, we may recover a natural feeling of participating directly in reality, coming into being moment to moment, right? And we may have emotions and felt senses that are very similar. Well, let's say this, they resemble some of the added dimensionality that is natural to dreaming. Now, of course, when I say the word dreaming, there's a huge, maybe an infinite scope of different experiences that fit in there. And honestly, I think there are thousands of kinds of dreams or kinds of dreaming experience. And we could, break them down into 4 or 5 or try to make the number manageable. But it's actually so profoundly unique and local to each dream. We have to keep both things in mind. Yes, it's a dream, and so it has likeness with other dreaming experiences. But it also, at the same time, has unimaginable novelty that doesn't fit in any category at all, right? So it has both these things. And this is part of why we need dreaming consciousness in our waking awareness, because otherwise everything just collapses into thingness. That's a this is a that, here's what you do with this, here's how it's supposed to be, so on and so forth. Right? It's not habitable terrain for awareness. And it's cruel to our imaginations. But psychedelics can, and often do, reintroduce something that I think resembles aspects of what is possible if we're lucidly awake. So a writer sort of has a license to dream, right? Anyone who makes stories and scenes and vignettes and poems and paintings and dances and songs and even, it's true, technologies, right? Coders. They have a license to dream, but I'm going to stay mostly with the arts. Right? And part of their dreaming, the sort of payoff is that they involve the audience in dreaming while the audience is awake. And this can be a very beautiful and noble endeavor. Right? To dream together in a meaningful way while we're awake. Yeah. And to have some of the dimensionality and the deep potential for participation in being, right, rather than observation of being. And it's funny because to even speak of such things begins to invoke them, right? This is another path to making the door, to wonder about such matters deeply and passionately, or to pursue them, hopefully somewhat playfully, in the same way that our dreaming is playful, though it isn't only playful. This is another way of making the door. So, in the dreaming Gronch, the first position is keep dreaming. The second is collapse into waking. The third is the sudden acquisition of new degrees of liberty in awareness. The mixture, the mating, the gentle mating of an aspect of our waking minds with the dreaming manifold. And so similarly, the third aspect of a waking world Gronch is successfully traversing the first two. Although I guess, wow, now that I think about it, perhaps I got this wrong. So, branch one in the waking world is the question or feeling or fascination that something's astonishing here, right? Something's very novel and maybe magical, and we're not sure what it is, right? We can't just say, oh, it's just this, or we refuse to. Yeah? I guess the second position, if it's actually a polarity, the second position is the waking world just collapses into dreaming. Now, that position can be really strange. I've experienced that. And usually what happens for me in this way is, for some reason, I become extremely sleepy very suddenly. And the moment I lie down, I'm engaged in this incredible vision of like wild significance and beauty and often intelligence, and by intelligence I mean it's teaching me things. So maybe this is the second branch here, right? Because in dreaming the second branch collapses to waking, so in waking the second branch just collapses into dreaming or even visionary experience. And maybe that can happen without us being asleep. I've certainly had experiences like that too, or at least that resemble that quality. But the third branch is, in waking, the intelligent and creative reintroduction of imaginal intelligence and the dimensionalities that disappear from our sensing and thought and experience most of the time when we're awake. The extra domains of identity and meaning and connotation. Now, of course, if something like this goes wrong, you can get various features of psychosis or mental illness. Because some of those extra dimensions can be recaptured by the waking mind, and then we have a real problem, especially if it's trying to evict them Um, so in that case, right, there's ways for this process to go sideways. Sometimes it does. It's certainly more likely to do so under stress, or if we feel threatened, which of course I guess is a kind of stress, or trapped, or we're injured, or we're sick, or, we've suffered the kinds of trauma that often produce long-term transformations of our waking world minds. And even these things can teach us about all kinds of things about the nature of our minds and awareness and the possibilities of for waking lucidity. Now, often the term lucidity isn't used in the way I'm using it. To be lucid means to be in a clear, coherent state of mind. Which could be described as you are properly dominated by the non-imaginal aspects of rational thought, conception, speech, behavior, motivation, fear, and so on. Well, that's almost the description of a prison, especially for the imagination. And I think we could do with a bit of a jailbreak there. Most of us, I certainly can. So I'm very interested in all these matters. I want to understand. It's very clear to me that our relationships with language and knowledge and culture and society are very dangerous in all kinds of ways, and they capture and evict aspects of our interiority that life becomes miserable without them. And, to be a human being is very challenging in a variety of unusual ways for animals, as well as including many of the usual problems for animals. The weird thing about us is we mostly invent our own predators, right? That's a pretty weird thing for an animal to do. It's eradicated most of the things that can predate on it, and then it pretty much becomes its own predator through institutions and societies and war and poverty, wrecking the environment and so on. That's a bad dream. And if we're going to wake up from that dream, which I would really love, any degree of movement in that direction would be a staggering moment of victory and worthy of celebration. We need our imagination. And so we need to help each other learn and discover and recover these faculties that were always natural to our people. But over the span of the evolution of the minds most of us are saddled with today, many of the faculties got evicted, or they got counterfeited, or they got represented, or they became systematized, right? And in all of those cases, the sort of living brightness of our imagination, our wonder, our capacity for direct participation in being and time and relation and circumstance, deeply profound, direct participation. What Owen Barfield calls original participation, I think. It's been largely amputated, and so that makes us really vulnerable to anything that mimics it, right? To anything that presents with an aspect that resembles what we've lost and are hungry for. And unfortunately, because all of this is happening in awareness and in thought, we cannot see it. It's very, very difficult to look at it. In order to see it, one has to somehow acquire a position beyond it. Now, interestingly, dreaming is one of those positions. It's beyond it, and it can include it. And lucid dreaming is a fascinating thing worth exploring, though I think we should be very careful about developing strongly believed theories of what lucid dreaming is. I think we should be cautious about that. But lucid waking is really much more important because it's over here that we're starving. Over there we're mostly nourished. And it's also very important to recognize the nature of the relationship, to explore and gain deeper understanding of the nature of the relationship between dreaming and memory. Because, trust me when I tell you, these are like the inside and the outside of an octopus, right? You don't see the inside, but the outside's an expression of the inside. Right? And so too with all things. And the inside can be an expression of something truly inconceivable. And getting a taste of that is like drinking from the fountain. Our own soul is a little droplet of having an adventure far away in embodied existence. I'm sure I'll think of many more things I wanted to share, but for now, I wish you beautiful dreaming and hope that you may, on purpose or accidentally, form the door that opens from dreaming into waking world experience in a way that's gentle and beautiful, intelligent, creative, inspiring, reassuring, and profound. Perhaps we can open it together. Thank you for joining me. May your ways be bright and beautiful.